The first time I understood that the forest did not care whether I lived or died was not during a storm or a wildfire or a rescue gone wrong. It was in the stillness, when everything familiar went quiet at once, as if the woods were holding their breath and waiting for me to make a mistake. My name doesn't matter as much as the uniform once did. I am 42 years old now, though I was younger when this began. Young enough to believe that experience could shield me from fear, that knowledge of terrain and procedure could keep the dark at arm's length. I worked as a forest ranger in a high-elevation national forest in the northern United States, a place locals referred to as the Old Pines, a vast stretch of timber where the trees grew so tall and close together that sunlight arrived late and left early. The land was ancient, the kind of ancient that makes maps feel like suggestions rather than truths. People come to places like that believing they are empty. They look at the trailheads, the campsites, the marked roads, and they assume what lies between them is neutral ground. I knew better, or I thought I did. My job was to protect hikers, enforce regulations, recover the lost, and when necessary, explain away the things people could not understand. Sounds at night. Lights where there should be none. Footprints that did not match any animal in the book. Most of the time, there were explanations. Wind, elk, sleep deprivation, grief. Fear has a way of inventing shapes when people are tired. That belief carried me for years. It made me good at my job. It also made me blind. The locals, the ones whose families had lived near the forest for generations, spoke about it differently. They never used official names for the trails or landmarks. They spoke in directions and warnings instead. Don't camp near the bent ridge. Don't follow sounds uphill after dark. If you hear someone calling your name, no matter how familiar the voice is, you walk the other way. When I first arrived, I chalked it up to folklore, stories passed down to keep children close to home. But even then, there was something in the way they spoke, not dramatic, not performative. Practical, as if they were talking about weather patterns or old injuries that still ached when the temperature dropped. I worked that forest for nearly a decade before the first incident that stayed with me. It was early fall, the season when the air sharpens and the ground starts to smell like cold iron and wet needles. I was on solo patrol checking a series of backcountry sites that rarely saw visitors. The radio crackled intermittently, but reception had always been unreliable there. That day, the forest felt heavier than usual, not dangerous, just watchful. Sound carried strangely. My boots seemed too loud. My breathing felt intrusive. About 5 miles in, I heard what I thought was a knock. It wasn't loud. It was steady. A dull wooden sound repeating at even intervals. Knock, pause, knock, not echoing, not random. It reminded me of someone testing a door with their knuckles. I stopped walking, waited, listened. The sound continued, deeper in the trees, off trail. Procedure said I should not investigate unknown noises alone. Instinct said someone might be hurt. I compromised, moving closer while keeping the sound in sight. If sound can be said to have a location. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. Not a breeze, not shade, just a drop. Sudden and localized, as if I'd stepped into a pocket of a different season. The knocking stopped when I was close enough to hear my own pulse in my ears. I stood there, scanning the trees, my hand resting near the radio. Nothing moved. No birds. No insects. Even the wind had gone still. Then I heard my name. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't whispered. It was spoken conversationally, the way a coworker might say it from behind you to get your attention. The voice was wrong, not distorted, not monstrous, just flat, like someone repeating a sound they'd heard without understanding how it was supposed to feel. I turned before I could stop myself. There was no one there, just trees, their trunks pale and scarred, rising straight up into shadow. I told myself it was fatigue, or memory playing tricks. I keyed the radio, reported a possible auditory hallucination. My own words sounded ridiculous even as I said them, and retreated to the trail. By the time I reached my truck, the forest had resumed its normal rhythms. Birds, wind, distance. I drove back, convinced I'd overreacted. I didn't file a report. That was my first mistake. Over the next year, the incidents multiplied. Not all with me. Hikers reported hearing footsteps matching their pace just beyond the edge of their headlamps. A survey crew found a campsite with all the equipment neatly arranged, food untouched, tents zipped from the outside. No sign of struggle. No sign of departure. The people were never found. We used the word disappearances in our paperwork, but among ourselves, we called them quiet losses. No screams, no blood, just absence. The forest began to feel less like a place and more like a presence. Sound became unreliable. Echoes arrived before their sources. Smells lingered where they shouldn't. Wet fur on dry days, cold stone far from any exposed rock. Once, during a winter patrol, I brushed my bare hand against a tree and felt warmth beneath the bark, as if something inside it was breathing. I started sleeping poorly. When I did sleep, I dreamed of caves, narrow, lightless spaces where the walls pressed close and the air tasted old. In those dreams, I was always searching for something I had lost, though I never knew what it was. I woke each time with the same thought lodged in my mind: there are places we are not meant to look into. The turning point came during a late-season search operation. A teenager had gone missing after wandering off-trail near a limestone formation locals avoided. They called it a cave, though maps marked it as a shallow overhang. I knew the area, or I thought I did. We formed a line and moved carefully, calling out, listening for any response. The temperature dropped as we approached, breath fogging in the afternoon light. Inside, the cave was deeper than it should have been. The rocks swallowed sound. Our lights seemed dimmer there, as if the darkness absorbed them. Halfway in, I found footprints, bare, too large for a child, pressed deep into the damp stone. They led farther than any human should have been able to walk without equipment. I don't remember deciding to. I only remember the certainty that turning back would be worse. The footprints ended abruptly at a smooth wall of rock. No exit, no collapse, just stone, unmarked. As I stood there, the air shifted. A smell filled the space. Pine sap and something musky beneath it, something alive. Behind me, I heard breathing, slow, controlled, close enough that I could feel it against my neck. I did not turn around. Every instinct I had told me that if I did, I would not leave that place as myself. I backed away, step by careful step, never breaking eye contact with the rock until I felt open air again. When I finally emerged, my team was gone. Not scattered. Gone. Radios silent. Tracks erased. I was alone with the forest, which had gone very, very quiet. I made it back by following the sound of my own heartbeat, counting steps, refusing to listen to anything else. When I reached the road, hours had passed. No one could explain where the others had gone. Officially, they were lost to terrain and weather. Unofficially, no one spoke their names again. I resigned not long after. Some said burnout, some said trauma. The locals simply nodded, as if I had finally learned what they had always known. I still walk the edges of forests sometimes. I still feel the pull when the pines grow close together and the light fades too quickly. But I do not step inside anymore. Because I have learned this, and it is the only lesson that matters. The forest does not hunt the way we understand hunting. It waits. It listens. And when you stop respecting the silence, when you assume you are alone, it reminds you how small you are. And somewhere beneath those trees and caves that do not appear on any map, something is still knocking, patient as time itself, waiting for a name to answer. I told myself that leaving the uniform behind would quiet the memories, that distance would thin them out until they became manageable, like old scars you only notice when the weather changes. That belief lasted exactly 3 months. The forest did not release me just because I stopped clocking in. It followed me in subtler ways, through smells carried on the wrong wind, through the way silence pooled too deeply in ordinary places, through the sensation that certain thoughts were no longer entirely my own. I took a temporary job doing maintenance and safety inspections for remote fire lookout stations. It kept me near the woods without forcing me into their deeper arteries. I convinced myself it was a compromise, a controlled exposure. In truth, I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed away too long, as if the forest might notice the absence and grow offended by it. One of those lookouts sat on the edge of the old pines, perched on a ridge locals avoided after sunset. The structure was nearly a century old, weathered timber, rusted stairs, windows clouded by decades of wind-blown grit. From the outside, it looked harmless. From the inside, it felt wrong. The air inside the cab was always colder than outside, no matter the season, and sound behaved strangely there. Voices lingered after you stopped speaking. Footsteps echoed when no one moved. I arrived late in the afternoon, planning to stay overnight and complete the inspection at first light. The radio worked intermittently, same as always. I logged my arrival, unloaded my gear, and climbed the stairs. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the forest below darkened into a dense, shifting mass. From that height, the trees no longer looked individual. They looked connected, like a single organism breathing in unison. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in a blanket and tried to sleep, but the quiet was oppressive. Not peaceful, compressed, the kind of silence that feels engineered. Around midnight, I heard movement on the stairs, slow, deliberate steps, too heavy to be wind, too rhythmic to be an animal. I froze, listening. The steps stopped just below the trapdoor. Then came the knocking. It was the same sound I'd heard years earlier. Dull, wooden, patient, knock, pause, knock. Each impact vibrated faintly through the floorboards. My mouth went dry. I did not answer. I did not move. The knocking continued for several minutes, never changing tempo, never growing louder or more aggressive. Eventually it stopped. Relief lasted only seconds. A smell seeped into the room, pine sap, wet earth, and underneath it that same musky warmth I remembered from the cave. I pressed my sleeve to my nose, fighting the urge to retch. The trapdoor creaked, not opening, just shifting slightly as if something below were testing its weight. Then a voice drifted up through the boards. It was not my name this time. It was a list. Names spoken slowly, carefully, each one separated by a pause. Some I recognized immediately, members of my old team, the missing teenager, hikers whose cases I'd read about but never worked. Others were unfamiliar, new, spoken with the same careful neutrality, as if the speaker were checking items off an inventory. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound did not diminish. It wasn't traveling through air. It was resonating through the structure itself, through the wood, through my bones. When the list ended, the voice said one final thing, softer than the rest. You forgot. I don't remember deciding to flee. I remember being halfway down the stairs, my foot slipping on frost-slick wood, my shoulder slamming into the railing. The forest below was pitch black, the stars smothered by cloud. I ran anyway, guided by terror and muscle memory, crashing through underbrush, ignoring the pain as branches tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me, something moved, not chasing, matching. I could hear it adjusting its pace to mine, never gaining, never falling back. Each time I slowed, it slowed. When I stumbled, it paused. The sound it made was subtle, a low exhale timed with my breathing as if we shared lungs. I broke free of the tree line and reached my truck, fumbling for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice. When the engine finally turned over, the headlights illuminated the road, and something else. Footprints. They were enormous, pressed deep into the dirt, bare and elongated, toes splayed unnaturally wide. They stopped inches from my driver's side door. I drove until dawn. I did not return to that lookout. Officially, I cited structural instability. Unofficially, I knew the truth. That place had been used before, not as shelter, but as a vantage point. Something had learned to wait there, had learned the sound of human schedules, human expectations. In the weeks that followed, reports trickled in. Campers hearing knocks on their RV doors far from any road, hunters finding their tracks mirrored beside them, step for step. A pair of hikers swore they'd seen a tall, pale shape standing motionless between the trees, its outline shimmering as if the air around it were bending. The word Yeti surfaced more than once. I understood the impulse. People need names. Names create boundaries. But what we were dealing with did not fit neatly into folklore. It did not behave like an animal defending territory. It behaved like something practicing. The final incident, the one that ended my proximity to the forest entirely, occurred during a volunteer search for an elderly man who'd wandered from his cabin during a snowstorm. The cave appeared again, though none of us had planned to go near it. The tracks led there regardless, winding through drifts, purposeful. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been. The walls glistened, damp with condensation. Deeper in, the passage narrowed, forcing us to move single file. My chest tightened as the space closed around us. The smell intensified. That's when we heard the breathing. Not labored, not strained. Calm, confident. It came from ahead and behind us at once, filling the space so completely it was impossible to tell direction. One of the volunteers panicked and turned to run, colliding with something solid that should not have been there. I saw it then. Tall, broad, its outline blurred at the edges, as if reality itself struggled to agree on its shape. Its eyes reflected our lights with unsettling intelligence, and when it spoke, because it did speak, it used the voice of the man we were searching for. "Help me," it said, perfectly, pleading, familiar. Something inside me finally broke. Not fear, recognition. I understood in that moment that this thing did not steal bodies. It borrowed voices, memories, patterns. It lived in the spaces we avoided, in the dark we refused to map, and it survived by learning us. We escaped because it let us. I believe that now with absolute certainty. I live far from the old pines these days. I tell my story to anyone who will listen, not for attention, not for absolution, but because silence is what it wants most. The forest does not need belief. It needs access. If there's anything left of me that still feels like a ranger, it is this instinct to warn, even when no one wants to hear it. Because the spirits of the pines are not myths, they are memories with teeth. And once they learn your name, they do not forget. After that last search, the official explanations hardened quickly, like concrete poured over a fracture no one wanted to look at too closely. Hypothermia, disorientation, stress-induced hallucination. The volunteers were debriefed, thanked, and quietly discouraged from speaking publicly. I was asked, politely, firmly, to stop assisting with any future operations. Liability, they said. Optics. I understood the language. It was the same language I had once used myself to fence off the unexplainable and keep it from infecting the rest of the system. I packed what little gear I still owned and moved south, then farther, putting miles between myself and the forest. On paper, it worked. New routines, new terrain, different trees, shorter, younger, less imposing. But fear does not obey geography. It adapts. It waits. The nights were the worst. Not because of nightmares, those were manageable, but because of the waking moments just before sleep, when the world goes quiet and the mind starts taking inventory. That was when I noticed the sounds. A faint knock sometimes, coming from within the walls of whatever place I was staying. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. Never loud enough to wake anyone else. Never consistent enough to record. I learned to live with it the way people live with tinnitus, by pretending it wasn't there. Smell became another problem. Pine sap where there were no pines. Damp stone in dry apartments. Once, standing in line at a grocery store, I caught the unmistakable scent of wet fur and felt my knees buckle. The cashier asked if I was all right. I lied, automatically. I began writing things down, not stories, records, dates, locations, sensations. I needed to know whether what I was experiencing followed patterns or if it was finally my own mind collapsing under accumulated stress. What emerged was worse than either possibility. The incidents clustered around moments of stillness, when I stopped moving forward with my life, when I lingered too long in reflection. It was as if attention itself acted as an invitation. That realization dragged up an older memory, one I had worked very hard to bury. Early in my career, before the confidence and the rules calcified, I'd been part of a recovery operation near the same cave system. A seasonal worker had fallen while surveying rock stability. By the time we reached him, he was already gone. Officially, the cause of death was blunt force trauma. Unofficially, there were marks on his body no one could explain. pressure bruises along his arms and torso as if he'd been held, not dragged, held in place. I remembered standing there, young and overwhelmed, listening to a senior ranger argue that adding speculation to the report would only harm the department. I remembered nodding, signing off, letting the paperwork smooth over the unease in my gut. I had told myself it was professionalism. What it really was, I understood now, was consent. "You forgot," the voice at the lookout had said. No, I had chosen. The final escalation came years later when I believed, foolishly, that enough time had passed. I had been invited to speak at a small conference on wilderness safety, sharing lessons learned from search and rescue work. I almost declined. Public attention felt dangerous. But another part of me, the part that still believed in warnings and preparation, agreed. The venue was a converted lodge on the edge of a state forest. Not the old pines, not even close. I arrived early, checked into my room, and spent the afternoon reviewing notes. As evening fell, the familiar heaviness settled in my chest. The forest outside was quiet in a way I recognized immediately. That night there was a knock at my door. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. I did not open it. The knocking continued, unhurried, for nearly an hour. I stood with my back against the far wall, phone in hand, listening as the sound shifted, from the door to the window, from the window to the wall behind my head. Always measured, always calm. Then it stopped. Relief surged and died as a shadow passed beneath the door. Too tall, too narrow. It did not move like a person walking past. It lingered, stretching, thinning, as if learning the dimensions of the space. A smell crept in, stronger than ever before. Pine, stone, something warm and alive. My phone vibrated, a voicemail notification. No missed call, just the message. I listened. It was my own voice, not a recording I remembered making, not distorted, clear, calm. It spoke about duty, about silence, about how some places needed to stay buried for a reason. When it finished, another voice joined in beneath it, a low, steady breathing that matched my own in real time. I did not sleep. At dawn, I left without checking out, without speaking to anyone. The conference went on without me. I drove until the sun was high and the air felt thin again, like something had loosened its grip. I understand now what the cave represents. It is not just a physical space. It is a boundary, a place where we hide what threatens our sense of order. The forest has many such places. So do we. And when we refuse to acknowledge what we've buried, it finds ways to surface. That is why I'm telling this story now, even knowing the risk. Not because I believe I can stop it. I don't. What lives in the pines is older than titles and older than fear. But I believe awareness changes the shape of things. It narrows the spaces where silence can fester. If you walk in the woods and feel watched, trust that feeling. If you hear knocking where no one should be, do not answer. And if the forest ever speaks to you in a voice you recognize, remember this. Some lessons are learned by leaving. Others are learned by refusing to forget. And the spirits of the pines are listening, always, for which choice you make. There is a moment, after you have lived long enough with fear, when it stops feeling like an intruder and starts feeling like a measure. Not a warning exactly, but a scale. Fear shows you where the edges are, where the world thins, where the stories we tell ourselves about control and order begin to fray. I live inside that awareness now. It has shaped the rest of my life more than any badge or title ever did. I stopped running after that night at the lodge. Not because the fear vanished, but because I understood that distance alone was not the answer. The forest was not following me in a physical sense. It was responding to something quieter, memory, complicity, the long echo of silence. The truth I had avoided was simple and devastating. What frightened me was not only what lived out there among the pines, but what I had allowed to live unspoken inside myself. I returned to the margins of wilderness slowly, carefully, not as a ranger, not as a protector, as a witness. I volunteered with historical archives, cataloging oral histories from rural communities near protected lands, old recordings, handwritten journals, stories no one had wanted to formalize because they did not fit scientific language. I listened more than I spoke, And over time, patterns emerged, stories separated by decades and miles, yet threaded together by the same details, knocking sounds that preceded disappearances. Caves or fissures locals avoided without being able to explain why. Tall figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, never directly approached, voices borrowed from the missing, and always, always an emphasis on forgetting, on moving on sealing places off and pretending that was the same thing as understanding them. One elderly man, his hands trembling as he spoke, told me something that finally reframed everything. He said his grandfather had worked as a guide long before the forest was designated, long before uniforms or boundaries. Back then, people believed certain areas were not dangerous in the way predators were dangerous, but consequential. If you went there uninvited, something would be taken. Not always your life. Sometimes your certainty. Sometimes your ability to sleep without hearing things. The woods don't punish, the old man said. They remember. That sentence has stayed with me more than any report I ever filed. The final time I went near the old pines, I did not go alone. I went with a local woman whose family had lived at the forest's edge for generations. She did not carry a weapon. She did not carry a radio. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Pine resin, bone beads, scraps of paper covered in names. We did not cross the tree line. We stopped where the light still reached the ground. She placed the bundle at the base of a weathered trunk and spoke quietly, not to the forest, but into it. She named the missing, not to summon them, to acknowledge them, to remind whatever listened that forgetting had not been total. The air shifted, not colder, older, warmer, just attentive. For the first time in years, I did not feel watched. That does not mean it ended. I am not offering comfort wrapped as closure. Some things do not resolve, they recede, they wait. The forest remains what it has always been, vast, patient, indifferent to human timelines. But I learned something essential that day, something I wish I had understood when I first put on that uniform. Protection is not dominance. Knowledge is not ownership. Silence is not neutrality. We like to believe the wilderness exists for us to conquer, catalog, and explain. We build trails, post signs, assign rangers, and call it stewardship. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is not. There are places where respect means restraint, where the bravest choice is not to press forward, but to step back and leave room for what we do not yet understand. If this story unsettles you, that is not an accident. Awe and fear share a border. They are both responses to encountering something larger than yourself. The difference lies in how you carry that encounter forward. You can dismiss it, rationalize it, bury it, or you can let it change the way you listen. I no longer work as a forest ranger, but the part of me that once walked those trails with responsibility still exists. It shows up now as vigilance of a different kind, watching for the ways we repeat old mistakes, warning when curiosity turns careless, speaking when silence becomes dangerous. Because the spirits of the pines are not legends meant to scare children indoors. They are reminders of limits, of memory, of the cost of treating ancient places like empty ones. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and everything goes quiet all at once, no wind, no birds, no insects, do not rush to fill that silence. Do not call out. Do not knock back. Listen. Somewhere beneath the roots and stone, something is listening too. And what matters most is not whether it knows your name, but whether you remember your own. The night the forest finally spoke back to me, it did not use words. It used breath. Cold, deliberate breath, rolling out of the trees in slow waves, heavy enough that I could feel it press against my chest before I ever understood I was afraid. My name doesn't matter much anymore. In the reports, I'm listed as a ranger with 12 years of service, mid-30s, assigned to a high-elevation national forest where the pine trees grow so dense that daylight arrives late and leaves early. To the locals, I was just another uniform. Someone paid to keep hikers on trails, put out illegal fires, and tell curious tourists why certain caves were closed for safety reasons. To myself back then, I was something else entirely. I believed I was a guardian. someone the woods tolerated because I respected their rules. That belief lasted until the first winter I worked the northern sector, until the spirits of the pines decided I was listening closely enough. The forest I worked in sits above an old mountain range, older than the maps that name it. The locals never called it by its official title. They referred to it as the quiet ground, not because it was peaceful, but because sound behaved strangely there. Wind died abruptly. Footsteps carried too far. And sometimes, when everything should have been loud, during storms, during animal migrations, the forest held its breath, as if waiting for something to pass. I learned early that the people who lived along the forest boundary avoided eye contact when I asked about certain trails, especially the ones near the cave system we kept fenced and padlocked year-round. They would shrug, mutter about bad footing or unstable rock, then change the subject. Only once did an older man linger long enough to say something that stuck with me. "Caves don't keep echoes," he said. "They keep memories." I laughed it off at the time. Rangers are trained to replace superstition with procedure. Missing hiker, grid search. Strange sound, elk, owls, thermal shifts. Fear, we're taught, is usually just ignorance looking for a story. My first real test came late one October when the trees were shedding needles in thick, rust-colored drifts and the air smelled permanently of sap and frost. A solo camper failed to check out. Late 20s. Experienced. His truck was still parked at a pull-off near a decommissioned trail, one that hadn't officially existed for years but still appeared on old GPS units. I volunteered to take the night watch. The forest after dark is never truly silent, but that night the quiet felt manufactured. Artificial. Like a room after a loud argument where everyone is pretending nothing happened. My flashlight beam cut tunnels through the pines, illuminating bark scarred with old claw marks. Bare, I told myself, though they were higher than I liked. About a mile in, I heard it. A single knock. Not a branch snapping. Not a rock tumbling. A knock, wood on wood, measured and intentional. It came from my left, deep in the trees, and repeated itself after a pause long enough to make me doubt the first sound had been real. I called out, identifying myself, voice steady, because it had to be. Ranger protocol. If someone was lost or injured, sound was their lifeline. The knock answered again, closer this time. That was when the temperature dropped, not gradually, but all at once, like I'd stepped into a pocket of winter preserved beneath the canopy. My breath fogged thick and fast, and the smell hit me next. Wet fur, old earth, something metallic underneath, like blood left too long in the open. I told myself it was a moose, or a prank, or my nerves catching up to me. Then I saw the footprints. They were wrong in a way that's hard to articulate unless you've spent years reading the ground like a language. Too wide, too deep, and spaced too far apart. Whatever made them walked upright, but not like a person. The heel impressions were shallow. The toes, if that's what they were, dragged as if the thing was unfamiliar with the act of stepping lightly. I followed them despite every instinct screaming that I shouldn't. That's the first lesson the forest taught me. Fear doesn't make you freeze. It makes you justify. It whispers reasons into your head until you're already committed. The tracks led toward the cave. We kept that entrance sealed with steel gates and warning signs citing rockfall, toxic air, unstable formations. All true to a point. But standing there that night, flashlight trembling in my grip, I noticed something I'd never seen before. The gate was open, not forced, not damaged, simply unlatched as if someone had passed through and closed it behind them out of habit. From inside the cave came a sound that finally broke my composure. Breathing, slow, deep. Too controlled to be an animal. It echoed outward, not bouncing, but flattening, as though the cave itself was swallowing the sound before it could escape. I radioed in. Static answered. I told myself the missing camper was inside, injured, hypothermic. I told myself this was why I wore the badge, why I memorized procedures, why I believed I belonged out here. And still, as I stepped past the threshold, I felt something fundamental shift, like crossing a line that had been drawn long before I ever arrived. The cave air was warmer than the forest, damp and heavy, carrying that same fur and iron scent. My light swept over walls marked with scratches that spiraled upward higher than any human could reach. Deeper inside, I saw handprints in the stone, pressed, not painted, as if the rock had been soft once, pliable under desperate fingers. Then I heard my name, not spoken, exhaled. It came from the dark ahead, wrapped in that slow breathing rhythm, and in that moment, denial finally cracked, not shattered, cracked just enough to let something older and colder seep through. Because no one in this forest should have known my name, and whatever was waiting in that cave had been listening to the pines for a very long time. The sound of my name didn't echo. It didn't bounce or fade the way sound should inside a cave. It settled instead, like dust, onto the back of my neck, into my ears, into the small spaces of my thoughts where reason usually lived. I stood there longer than I should have, boots planted just inside the threshold, hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Training told me to retreat, reassess, wait for backup. Pride told me that turning around would mean admitting the forest had finally found a way inside me. So I took another step. The cave narrowed quickly, stone pressing in from both sides. Moisture dripped from the ceiling in irregular intervals, each drop landing with a sound that felt too loud, too final. The beam of my flashlight revealed layers of mineral deposits like frozen waves, pale and smooth, interrupted by those same gouges I'd seen near the entrance. They followed the curve of the walls inward, deeper, as if something had used the cave not as shelter, but as a corridor. I kept moving because stopping felt worse. Every few yards the air shifted, warm to cold, dry to damp. It reminded me of breathing, like the cave itself was alive and testing me, adjusting its lungs to match mine. When I paused to listen, the breathing sound I'd heard earlier stopped as well, as though whatever was inside had learned my rhythm and was now waiting for me to make the next mistake. That was when I noticed the silence behind me. Forests are never quiet, even underground. Wind finds cracks, water finds pathways. But when I glanced back toward the entrance, my light revealed nothing but darkness swallowing the path I'd come from. No breeze, no distant night sounds, just a heavy, expectant stillness that felt intentional. I called out again, voice steady but louder now. "If you're hurt, call back. I can help you." The response came from directly behind me. Not footsteps, not movement. Just that same slow exhale, close enough that I could feel warmth brush the back of my ear. I spun around, heart slamming so hard it stole my breath, flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught stone, shadow, then something tall and pale that recoiled the instant the light touched it. I only saw fragments. Long limbs folded wrong, hair matted and dark, skin the color of old bones stretched too tight over muscle. It retreated with a speed that defied its size, disappearing into a side passage so narrow I wouldn't have thought anything larger than a fox could fit through. The smell intensified, flooding the cave. Wet fur, rot, iron. Panic arrived then, not all at once, but in stages. First the cold rushed through my limbs, then the shaking. Then the realization that I was no longer in control of my own breathing. I forced myself to count, an old trick. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. But the cave didn't let me keep the rhythm. Drips fell faster, my breath fogged unevenly. Somewhere in the dark, something else adjusted its pace to mine again. I backed away, slow, deliberate, refusing to turn my back on whatever I'd seen. The beam of my flashlight wavered, catching flashes of movement that might have been shadows or might not. My radio crackled suddenly, bursting to life with overlapping voices that weren't voices at all. Just noise shaped vaguely like speech, rising and falling in a cadence that made my stomach twist. Then, clear as day, a voice cut through the static. "Don't run." It sounded like me. That was the moment the cave claimed something from me. Not my life. Not my body. Something quieter. Something essential. I ran anyway. The passage seemed longer on the way out, stretching, bending in ways it hadn't before. I slipped once, skinning my palm on stone that felt warm to the touch, and when I pushed myself up, I saw fresh handprints appear in the rock beside mine, larger, deeper, fingers too long and spaced too far apart. I burst through the gate into the night air, gasping, lungs burning as if I'd been underwater. The forest greeted me with sound all at once: wind, insects, distant animal calls. So sudden it made my ears ring. I slammed the gate shut behind me and secured it with shaking hands, every instinct screaming to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. I didn't look back. The missing camper was found 2 days later, miles from where he should have been. Alive, technically. But whatever he'd seen or heard had hollowed him out. He stared through people, flinched at shadows, and when asked where he'd been, he only said one thing over and over until they sedated him. It learned my name. I filed my report carefully, removed anything that couldn't be explained. Animal encounter, disorientation, hypothermia. The cave remained closed, reinforced with additional barriers. Officially, the incident was resolved, but the forest doesn't respect paperwork. Winter came hard that year, snow piling deep enough to muffle even the boldest sounds. I tried to convince myself the experience had been an anomaly, a convergence of stress, isolation, imagination. Yet the pines seemed closer now, their branches bending inward as if listening. At night, from my cabin, I heard knocks echo faintly through the woods. Never close enough to pinpoint, never far enough to ignore. Other rangers mentioned strange things in passing: equipment moved, trails that didn't match maps, calls over the radio answered by voices that shouldn't have been on shift. No one said the word Yeti. No one said spirit. But we all started avoiding the northern sector after dark. The second winter incident happened during a storm. Visibility was near zero, snow coming down in thick, blinding sheets that erased depth and distance. A distress beacon activated near an old fire lookout, one that hadn't been staffed in decades. Protocol demanded response, so I went, alone, because the roads were impassable and time mattered. Halfway up the trail, the temperature dropped again. Not weather-related. Sudden. Localized. My eyelashes frosted over and the smell returned, cutting through the clean scent of snow like a blade. I heard footsteps matching mine. Not behind. Beside. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. I stopped. They stopped. I turned my head just enough to see movement through the snow. A towering silhouette pacing me, separated only by a thin line of trees. It never stepped fully into view, never made a sound beyond the crunch of snow, and yet I felt its attention settle on me with crushing weight. The radio crackled. "Still protecting them?" my voice asked from the speaker. Fear, real fear, stripped away the last of my rationalizations. I understood then that this wasn't a single creature, or even a single place. It was the forest's memory, something old that wore shapes the way humans wore clothes. Something that learned names because names gave it permission. I reached the lookout just as the storm peaked, heart hammering, hands numb. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been. The smell was overwhelming. Carved into the wooden walls were words, scratched deep and frantic. Names, dozens of them, some crossed out, some circled, some repeated until the wood splintered. And among them, newly carved, was mine. I didn't stay to read the rest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, until the forest sounds blurred into one continuous roar. I didn't stop running until dawn broke and the pines released me back to the edge of the world where people lived and pretended the dark stopped at their porch lights. I resigned 2 weeks later. I told myself it was burnout, told everyone else the same. But the truth followed me, quiet and patient. Even now, years later, when the wind moves through trees just right, I hear the knocks again, steady, deliberate, waiting for me to answer. The locals still whisper about the spirits of the pines, about the ranger who listened too closely. They say the forest doesn't take everyone it marks. Some it lets go. But it never forgets a name once it learns how to say it. I thought leaving would be enough, that if I put asphalt and streetlights between myself and those trees, the weight in my chest would lift, and the nights would slowly return to something resembling normal. That belief lasted exactly 3 weeks. The amount of time it took for the forest to prove distance meant nothing once you'd been claimed. I moved south, closer to a mid-sized town that bordered another stretch of protected land. Different forest, different elevation, different management district. On paper, it was a clean break. I took a desk job tied loosely to land use review and emergency coordination. No patrols, no night watches, no caves. The first few nights, I slept with the kind of exhaustion that feels earned, the kind that shuts down dreams before they can form. But sleep, like the forest, adapts. It learns your habits. And once my body stopped collapsing from fatigue, something else stepped in to fill the space. Sound came first. A soft knocking that slipped into my dreams and followed me back into waking. 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats, always the same pattern. It came from everywhere and nowhere, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from beneath the floor, sometimes from inside my own chest. I told myself it was pipes, neighbors, old buildings settling, all the lies we use when admitting the truth would require us to change how we live. Then the smell returned. I caught it in places it didn't belong: parking garages, grocery aisles, my own apartment hallway. Wet fur and iron, faint but unmistakable. When I turned to locate the source, it vanished, leaving behind a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I stopped sleeping altogether after the first dream. In it, I was back in the cave, but the walls were wider now, smoother, shaped like corridors rather than tunnels. The breathing surrounded me, coming from every direction, layered over itself in slow, patient rhythms. Names echoed through the space, not shouted, not whispered, but pressed into the air like inscriptions. Some I recognized from the lookout wall, others were strangers. All of them sounded tired. At the end of the passage stood a pine tree, impossibly tall, its roots splitting the stone floor open like broken ribs. Something waited behind it, just out of sight, shifting its weight as if preparing to step forward. When I woke, my name was carved into the wooden headboard of my bed. Not written. Carved, deep enough that splinters littered the sheets. That was when denial finally died. I began researching, not legends, not folklore sites filled with exaggeration, but old incident reports, archived ranger logs, tribal records buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference. Patterns emerged quickly once I knew what to look for. Rangers who transferred suddenly, search and rescue veterans who quit without explanation, locals who refused to pass certain trails after sunset, mentions of tall figures, wrong footprints, voices mimicking loved ones, and always, always the caves. Every forest had them, some mapped, some sealed, some officially collapsed, but still appearing in satellite imagery like dark mouths in the earth. They were rarely the site of the first encounter, but they were almost always where things escalated. The cave wasn't a lair, it was an archive. That understanding settled into me slowly, painfully. The forest didn't hunt the way animals hunt. It collected, observed, learned, names, voices, habits, fears. It wore shapes that made sense to the people seeing them. Yeti, spirit, shadow, whatever fit the mind it was pressing against. Once you understood that, the rules changed. I stopped trying to escape and started trying to listen, carefully, selectively, on my terms. I returned to the edge of protected land, never crossing into the trees, just close enough to feel the pressure in the air shift. At night, I sat with the windows open, letting sound move through the apartment instead of trapping it inside. The knocking grew clearer. Not louder. Clear it wasn't a signal. It was a test, a call and response older than language. I realized then that every time I'd heard it before, I'd reacted emotionally. Fear, anger, curiosity. The forest wasn't feeding on terror, it was measuring attention. So one night, when the knocking came again, I did something I hadn't done since my first year as a ranger. I acknowledged it, out loud, calmly, without invitation. "I hear you," I said, "but I'm not yours." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then, faintly, a sound like trees shifting under heavy snow, movement without urgency, disappointment without anger. The dreams changed after that. I still walk the caves in my sleep, but now I'm not alone. I see others, figures standing just outside the light, their faces indistinct, their bodies marked by the same hollow exhaustion I'd seen in the missing camper. Some reach out when I pass. Some turn away. All of them carry names etched into their skin like scars. I wake knowing one truth with absolute certainty. The forest is not evil. It is old. And old things don't think in terms of good and bad. They think in terms of continuity, memory, balance. We build trails and fences and call it management. The forest listens, learns our systems, and waits for the moment when we forget why those rules existed in the first place. I tell this story now not as a warning, but as a record. Because the spirits of the pines don't need belief to exist. They need attention. And every time someone dismisses a sound they can't explain, every time a name echoes where it shouldn't, every time a cave gate is found open without damage, the forest writes another entry into itself. I survived because I stopped trying to dominate the dark and started respecting it. I don't wear the uniform anymore. I don't walk patrols, but I still keep the rules, even when no one is watching. I don't follow unmarked trails. I don't answer voices I can't see. And when the wind moves through the trees just right, when the knocking starts up again, distant but deliberate, I listen without responding. Some nights, that's enough. Other nights, I feel the forest lean closer, testing the boundary one more time, waiting to see if I remember who I am, waiting to see if I remember my name. There is a point, long after fear burns itself out, when what remains is something quieter and heavier. Not peace, not safety, awareness. That is where I live now. I don't tell people where I worked anymore. When they ask about my past, I say I was in land management, that I spent time outdoors, that I learned early how small people really are when stripped of their noise. Most nod politely. A few press for details. Those are the ones who already sense something is off about the woods they hike through on weekends, who felt watched without seeing eyes, who've heard their name carried on a wind that shouldn't know it. I never correct them. I never confirm their fears. Because the last lesson the forest taught me was not about survival. It was about legacy. The incidents didn't stop after I left. They never do. Rangers come and go, signs get replaced, gates get reinforced, reports are rewritten until the sharp edges are gone. But every few years, a name circulates quietly through the same channels I once monitored. A disappearance with no clear timeline, a search that feels wrong from the first step, a survivor who comes back changed in ways no checklist can capture. I recognize the pattern immediately, and sometimes, rarely, carefully I reach out. Not to interfere, not to warn directly, just to ask the kinds of questions that make someone slow down. Pay attention. Trust the part of themselves that knows when the forest is leaning in too close. Because here is the truth no orientation manual ever admits. The forest doesn't want everyone. It selects, not by strength, not by bravery, but by a quieter quality. Those who listen deeply, who notice patterns, who carry their attention like an open door. Rangers make ideal candidates, so do solo hikers. Search volunteers. Anyone who believes responsibility gives them authority. That was my mistake. I thought the badge meant I belonged. I thought protection was something you enforced. What I learned instead, standing at the edge of that cave with my name breathing back at me, is that belonging is negotiated. And the forest has been negotiating far longer than we have. The cave still exists. I know that because I've seen the satellite images. The shadow remains, despite multiple attempts to mark it as collapsed terrain. Equipment fails there more often than statistics can explain. Drones lose signal. Compasses drift. People feel unwell long before they reach the perimeter and turn back without knowing why. That's the forest showing restraint. That's mercy, if such a word applies. Sometimes, late at night, I sit outside wherever I'm living and listen to the trees. Even here, even miles from any protected land, the wind carries familiar rhythms if you're patient enough. Not the knocks, not anymore, but the deeper movements beneath them. Roots shifting, wood expanding, a language without syllables. I think about the names carved into that lookout wall, not just the ones I recognized, but the dozens I didn't. Rangers who never filed final reports, Locals whose families stopped asking questions after too many doors closed. Travelers whose stories ended somewhere between curiosity and confidence. They aren't ghosts, they're records. The forest keeps what it teaches, and what it teaches slowly. I don't believe the spirits of the pines want the world emptied of people. If that were the case, we'd be gone already. What they want, what they require is humility. Boundaries honored, even when no one is enforcing them. Attention given without entitlement. That is why the most dangerous people in the woods are not the reckless ones. It's the ones who think they understand. I've learned to live with the pressure of being remembered. It never fully fades. Some nights, when exhaustion lowers my guard, I still hear my name carried on a current of air that shouldn't exist. Not threatening, not inviting, acknowledging. When that happens, I ground myself in what is real. The weight of my body, the sound of my own breathing. The promise I made aloud years ago and have never broken since. I hear you, but I am not yours. That boundary matters. It may be the only thing that does. If you take anything from this story, if there is any lesson buried beneath the fear, let it be this. The wilderness is not a backdrop. It is not scenery. It is not a challenge waiting to be conquered or content waiting to be captured. It is a presence. And like any presence that has endured long enough to watch civilizations rise and rot, it does not tolerate arrogance for long. When you step beneath the pines, you are stepping into a memory older than your language. Walk gently. Listen more than you speak. And if the forest ever answers you back, if it speaks in breath or knock or voice, do not rush to respond. Not every call is meant to be returned. I was a ranger once. I believed my job was to protect the forest from people. Now I understand my real duty was learning how to protect people from believing the forest needed saving at all. The spirits of the pines are still there. Locals still whisper. Names still travel farther than bodies ever could. And somewhere beneath the roots, beneath the stone, beneath the caves we pretend are sealed, the forest continues to listen. Patient. Enduring. Waiting to see who remembers the rules when the dark starts listening back. I first understood something was wrong. The morning I found hoofprints on the concrete floor of the ranger station. Not mud tracked in by a careless visitor. Not pine needles blown in through a cracked door. Hoofprints, deep, oval impressions, as if the concrete had briefly softened under weight it was never meant to hold. They led from the front door to my desk, stopped inches from my chair, then turned around and walked back out the way they came. I stood there for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand, trying to reconstruct a rational sequence of events that could explain it. I told myself the slab must have been poured wrong years ago. Freeze-thaw cycles, an illusion of pattern. My mind was already searching for exits, excuses, anything that didn't require me to remember what I'd seen the night before. I am, or was, a U.S. Forest ranger assigned to a district most people never bother to name. A sprawl of mixed conifer forest, abandoned logging roads, old mining claims that predate records, and a few valleys the maps simply mark as restricted without explanation. I took this job because I wanted quiet. After 12 years in search and rescue, quiet felt like a mercy. I told myself the disappearances weren't my fault. I told myself that land this big eats people sometimes, the way oceans do. I told myself I was done counting faces. That was before the elk came back. The first time I saw it, I didn't register fear, just confusion. It stood at the tree line beyond the floodlights, body angled wrong, like it had been assembled by memory instead of anatomy. Too tall in the shoulders, legs too thin. Its coat was pale, almost ash-colored, and it didn't steam in the cold the way it should have. I remember thinking it looked unfinished. Then it lifted its head, and where the eyes should have been, there was nothing. Not sockets, not wounds, just smooth, dark skin, stretched tight as if eyes had never existed at all. I raised my flashlight out of reflex. The beam washed over its face and slid off, swallowed by that featureless plane. No blink, no flinch. It stood perfectly still, listening. I could hear it breathing, not the wet, animal rasp I expected, but something slow and measured, like a person trying to control their breath. "Go on," I said, because that's what you say to wildlife. My voice sounded small inside the radio silence of the night. The elk turned its head toward me. It didn't move its ears. Didn't need to. It oriented on my voice with an accuracy that made my stomach tighten. Then, very deliberately, it took one step forward, just enough for the light to catch the front of its chest. There were scars there, long, parallel lines healed over in patterns too straight to be natural. I lowered the flashlight and the dark rushed back in. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't file a report. I didn't log the encounter. I told myself it was exhaustion. Sleep deprivation has a way of manufacturing details. I'd been dreaming about the missing hiker again, the one from 3 winters back, a college kid who walked off a marked trail and vanished within shouting distance of a staffed lookout. We found his boot months later, placed upright on a rock like an offering. No tracks leading to it, no tracks leaving. I signed off on the final report myself. The second time the elk appeared, it was daylight. I was out checking a remote trailhead that hadn't seen use in years. The road there passes through a low basin where sound behaves strangely. Engines dull. Radios crackle. You feel watched even when there's nowhere to hide. I killed the truck and stepped out, and that was when I smelled it. Burnt hair, faint but unmistakable, carried on air that should have been clean. The elk stood in the middle of the clearing, broadside to me. Sunlight revealed details I wished it hadn't. The hide wasn't uniform. Patches of fur had been rubbed away, exposing skin beneath that looked wrong. Too smooth, too taut, like something stretched over a frame. Its hooves were cracked, edges chipped as if it had been walking on stone for a long time. I raised my binoculars and immediately regretted it. Up close, the absence of eyes was worse. There were shallow depressions where the sockets should have been, but no opening. The skin there twitched, rippling faintly as if something underneath was adjusting to the light. I lowered the binoculars and felt a pressure build behind my sternum, a cold weight that made it hard to breathe. The elk's head tilted, its mouth opened. No sound came out at first. Then softly I heard my name, not spoken, not shouted. It was layered, my voice overlaid with others, some deeper, some too high, all slightly out of sync. The sound didn't travel through the air so much as vibrate through the ground, up my boots, into my bones. I stumbled back and nearly fell. When I looked up again, the clearing was empty. No tracks, no disturbance, just the smell, lingering like a memory. That night, I dreamed of the station filling with snow. It poured in through the walls, through the floor, burying my desk, my radio, my hands. Beneath it all, something moved. I woke with frost on my breath, though the heater was running, my chest aching as if I'd been pressed under weight. The elk returned again and again. Sometimes it stood at the edge of the floodlights. Sometimes it appeared on the trail cameras, though never in the same frame twice. Reviewing the footage made my head hurt. Timestamps skipped. Shadows bent the wrong way. Once, the camera caught it standing inches from the lens. Head cocked. Skin where its eyes should have been pressed, so close it distorted as if trying to see through. Other rangers began to avoid the station at night. They didn't say why. They didn't have to. I overheard whispers about sounds under the floor, about voices on the radio that didn't match call signs. One of them quit after claiming he'd seen someone standing behind him in the reflection of the glass, someone with antlers. I tried to escalate. I contacted regional. I asked about the restricted zones, the old mines sealed without record, the bunkers marked on no map but known to everyone. The responses were polite and empty. Redirects, delays. One supervisor suggested I take leave. "You've been carrying a lot," he said. "Disappearances take a toll." He didn't ask which ones. The elk began to come closer. One night I woke to the sound of breathing inside the station, slow, careful. I lay still, hand on the sidearm I hadn't needed in years, listening as hooves clicked softly on concrete. The smell of wet fur filled the air, heavy and intimate. Something brushed my ankle, light, almost curious, and I bit down on a scream. When I finally forced myself to look, the station was empty. The floor was marked with fresh impressions, deeper than before, leading not to the door, but toward the basement stairs we never used, the ones bolted shut after a cave-in decades ago, the ones no one could quite explain. I stood there until dawn, staring at those prints, knowing with a certainty that felt like grief that whatever the elk was, it wasn't just visiting, it was waiting. I broke the bolts myself. I told everyone it was for inspection. Structural integrity, liability, words that keep people from asking questions. The truth was simpler and worse. The breathing had started again, and this time it was coming from below the floor. The basement stairs hadn't been used in decades. Officially, the lower level was sealed after a partial collapse connected to an abandoned mining tunnel that predated the station. Unofficially, everyone knew there were more levels than the blueprints admitted. Old civil defense maps hinted at extensions. Cold War paranoia layered on top of older, less documented projects. The kind of things that get buried not because they're dangerous, but because they're embarrassing to remember. When the final bolt snapped free, the sound echoed longer than it should have. The air that rolled up from below was wrong, warm and stale, carrying the smell of decay and something sharper, metallic, like blood diluted in water. I stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, flashlight shaking in my hand, listening. There was no breathing now, just silence so complete it rang. I descended slowly, counting each step like it mattered. The concrete walls sweated faintly, beads of moisture forming and sliding down as if the structure itself was exhaling. The temperature dropped with every foot, though the air against my skin felt intermittently warm, like passing through invisible heat waves. My radio crackled once, then went dead. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a corridor wider than it had any right to be. The flashlight beam struggled, swallowed by distance. Old signage peeled from the walls, numbers, arrows, warnings half scraped away. Someone had tried to erase this place and failed. I hadn't gone 10 steps when I heard it. Hooves, not above me, not behind, ahead, slow, deliberate. Each step placed with care as if whoever or whatever was walking understood exactly how sound traveled down here. I froze, heart hammering, and killed the flashlight. Darkness rushed in, thick and absolute. The hooves stopped. In the black, something shifted. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration through the soles of my boots, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. Then a voice, close enough that I could feel breath against my ear. "You left us." I spun, light flaring, gun half raised. The corridor behind me was empty. No elk, no person. Just the faint impression of heat lingering where something had stood. I backed up until my shoulders hit the wall, forcing myself to breathe. This was stress. Sleep deprivation. Guilt. I had a lifetime supply of reasons my mind could be doing this to me. I said them out loud, listing diagnoses like a prayer. The walls absorbed the sound without echo. Further down the corridor, something scraped. I followed it because the alternative, standing still, waiting, felt worse. The passage sloped downward, opening into a chamber that stole the air from my lungs. The ceiling disappeared into shadow. The floor was uneven, scattered with debris that crunched softly underfoot. In the center stood a structure that didn't belong underground, a series of metal pens, rusted but intact, arranged in a rough circle. Inside them were bones, not piles. Arrangements. Long bones stacked carefully, ends aligned. Skulls placed facing inward. Some were animal, some were not. A few still wore remnants of clothing, fabric fused to bone by time and moisture. I recognized a jacket, orange, high visibility, search and rescue issue from 10 years ago. My vision tunneled. I leaned against a post, fighting the urge to retch. The smell here was overwhelming now, decay layered with wet fur and that burnt hair tang that clung to the back of my throat. Something moved between the pens. The elk stepped into view, impossibly silent for its size. Down here, its proportions made more sense, as if the underground had been built for it. Its antlers brushed the darkness overhead. The skin where its eyes should have been glistened, pulsing faintly. I raised the gun. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It didn't charge, didn't flee. It simply stood there, head tilted, listening to me breathe. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth. This time, the voice was clearer. You showed them the way. Images slammed into me, memories I hadn't thought about in years. A lost hiker, a shortcut suggested, a trail I'd walked 100 times but never marked properly, a decision made to save time, to feel competent, to get home before dark. They followed, the elk said, and its mouth didn't move right when it spoke. They always do. I screamed and fired. The shot thundered through the chamber, deafening. The bullet struck the elk square in the chest and passed through it like mist, slamming into the far wall with a metallic crack. The elk didn't react, didn't even blink, not that it could. Instead, it stepped closer. I felt the pressure then, not physical, psychological. A weight pressing down on my thoughts, dragging them toward places I'd buried. I saw faces, heard names called over radios that never answered, felt the cold certainty of signing reports, knowing they were lies by omission. You keep the paths, the elk said. You keep the quiet. It raised a foreleg and tapped the ground. The vibration rippled outward and the chamber responded. Walls groaned. Somewhere deeper, something answered, a low, resonant sound that made the bones in the pens tremble. I ran. I don't remember the path back. I remember doors slamming, corridors branching where none had been before, heat blooming in the middle of the cold, then vanishing, voices calling from side passages. Some I recognized, some I didn't, all of them promising help if I just turned around. At one point, I slipped and fell hard, the breath knocked out of me. Something brushed my ankle again, gentle, almost apologetic. I kicked and scrambled up, screaming into the dark. When I burst back into the station, daylight was spilling through the windows. Birds were singing. The normalcy was obscene. The basement door was sealed, bolted, untouched. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself it hadn't happened, that I'd had some kind of episode. I wrote reports filled with safe words and empty conclusions. I avoided the cameras. That night, the elk stood inside the station. It was close enough that I could smell it without moving. Wet fur, rust, old snow. It lowered its head until the smooth plane of its face hovered inches from mine. I felt a cold pressure settle on my chest, heavy and intimate. You don't get to leave, it said softly. You're part of the map now. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember waking to hoof prints on my desk, to radio chatter whispering my name from channels long decommissioned, to the certainty that the forest wasn't hunting me. It was keeping me. The station stopped feeling like shelter after that. Walls thin as paper, windows like open eyes. Every sound carried intention. Even daylight felt staged, as if the forest was performing normalcy just well enough to keep me functional. I stopped sleeping in my bunk and started dozing in a chair facing the door, sidearm in my lap, radio off, because the silence was preferable to the whispers. The elk did not appear every night. That was worse. On the nights it stayed away, the absence pressed harder than its presence ever had. The forest went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like an audience holding its breath. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls. Just the low electrical hum of the station, and beneath it, a vibration I felt more than heard, like something vast shifting its weight underground. I began finding things out of place. A mug turned upside down on my desk, still warm. A map unrolled to a section I hadn't looked at in years. The restricted valley, the one with no trail names, only contour lines packed so tight they looked like scars. Once I found dirt under my fingernails when I woke up, black and wet, smelling faintly of iron. I told myself I was sleepwalking. I told myself a lot of things. The guilt dreams came back stronger, not symbolic ones, specific, accurate. I dreamed of the people who'd vanished, but not as I remembered them. They stood in the trees at the edge of my flashlight beam, perfectly still, eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. When I called out, they didn't answer. They just listened, heads tilting in unison. Sometimes antlers branched from their skulls. I tried to leave, packed a bag, logged out of the system, left the keys on the hook. I made it as far as the truck before the pressure hit, an invisible force squeezing my chest until my vision tunneled and my knees buckled. The air tasted wrong, metallic and cold. I lay there gasping, cheek pressed to gravel, and heard hooves circle me slowly. "You know the way," a voice said, layered and patient. "You always have." When I came to, I was back inside the station, door locked from the inside, keys hanging neatly where I'd left them. My bag was unpacked, clothes folded, sidearm cleaned and returned to its case. That was when I started hearing things beneath the floor during the day. Not just breathing, movement. A distant scraping, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Sometimes voices, muffled and warped, rising and falling in patterns that made my skin crawl. Once I thought I heard laughter, thin, brittle, wrong. I went back down. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one left to tell. 2 more Rangers had transferred out. One quit without notice, leaving his truck idling in the lot. Door open, radio hissing static. Regional stopped returning my calls altogether. The basement door opened easier this time, like it wanted to. The corridor had changed. I know how that sounds. I know what stress does to perception. But the angles were different. The walls leaned inward subtly, forcing me to hunch as I walked. The air pulsed with heat and cold in alternating waves, making sweat bead on my skin 1 second and frost creep along the edges of my vision the next. I followed the sound this time instead of fighting it. It led me past the chamber of bones into a tunnel I hadn't seen before, a rough-hewn passage that smelled of wet earth and decay. Old support beams groaned overhead, wood petrified by time. Symbols had been carved into the walls, layered over one another in different styles, different eras. Some looked tribal, some military. Some I didn't recognize at all, shapes that hurt to focus on too long. The tunnel opened into a cavern that made my breath catch. It was vast, ceiling lost in darkness, floor sloping down toward a frozen lake that reflected nothing. The ice was thick, opaque, threaded with dark shapes suspended beneath the surface. I knew without seeing clearly what they were. Bodies. Preserved. Waiting. Around the lake stood structures, bunkers half swallowed by rock, doors sealed with rusted steel and warning signs in languages that had no business being here. Generators long dead. Cables disappearing into the ice. This was no accident. No natural formation stumbled into and sealed off. This was a place chosen. I knelt at the edge of the lake, pressing my gloved hand against the ice. Cold bit through instantly, sharp and invasive. Beneath my palm, something moved. The elk stepped out of the shadows behind me. Down here, it was clearer what it was and what it wasn't. Its body flickered at the edges, outline unstable, like an image struggling to hold shape. The antlers branched impossibly, casting shadows that moved independently of the light. The skin of its face rippled, bulging outward in places as if something beneath was pressing to get out. "This is where they keep the quiet," it said. I didn't turn. I couldn't. My hand was stuck to the ice, skin burning as if it were being drawn in. "They built over us," the elk continued. "Sealed us, fed us names and paths and promises. You were easier." Images flooded me again, sharper this time. Old reports. Classified stamps. Briefings I'd half listened to early in my career about anomalous zones, about keeping people moving along approved routes, about minimizing exposure, about not asking why. You guide them away, it said, or you guide them here. Either way, the land is fed. The ice cracked. A fissure spiderwebbed outward from beneath my hand, black water welling up, carrying with it the smell of rot and something older, mineral and deep. Fingers brushed mine from below, like pale and bloated, nails black with dirt. I screamed and tore my hand free, skin ripping, blood splattering across the ice. The elk watched without moving, patient as stone. "You're tired," it said gently. "Let us hold it." The cavern trembled. The bunkers groaned. Somewhere far below, something vast shifted, and the sound of it made my vision blur. I ran again. This time, the tunnels fought me. Floors sloped the wrong way. Passages narrowed until I had to crawl, rocks scraping my back, breath coming in ragged gasps. Voices echoed all around me now, overlapping, familiar and not, urging me to rest, to stop, to listen. When I finally burst back into the station, I collapsed on the floor, sobbing, hands bleeding, mind splintering under the weight of it all. The elk stood over me, not threatening, Not angry, waiting. You don't have much left, it said, but what you have is enough. It stepped back, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something else behind it. Not a creature, not a god, a system. Paths and disappearances. Silence maintained through ritual and routine. Rangers like me as unwitting priests keeping the balance by pretending not to see. The elk turned toward the basement door. When you're ready, it said, and vanished. The station is quiet now. Too quiet. The radio is dead. The cameras show nothing but static and occasionally a pair of antlers at the edge of the frame. I don't think this confession is meant to be heard. I think it's meant to be found. I stopped fighting on the seventh night. Not because I was brave, not because I understood. I stopped because resistance requires energy, and the forest had been draining mine in increments so small I didn't notice until there was nothing left to spend. Hunger without appetite, fatigue without sleep, thoughts that arrived already exhausted. The elk was waiting when I opened the basement door. It stood just beyond the first step, perfectly still, antlers brushing the ceiling that had never been that low before. The station lights flickered behind me, a weak human glow that felt suddenly childish. The smell of wet fur and cold stone filled my lungs, and beneath it, something familiar. The scent of old paper, of records rooms, of places where truth is stored and forgotten. "I'm ready," I said, and hated how calm my voice sounded. The elk turned and began to descend. This time, the stairs did not creak. The corridor did not resist. The walls widened, accommodating us as if this path had always been meant for two. My injured hand throbbed in time with the vibrations underfoot, a pulse that matched something far below. We passed the chamber of bones again. More had been added. Fresh ones. I recognized a watch on one wrist bone, the band cracked but intact, issued last year. I looked away and kept walking. Denial had finally burned itself out, leaving only a dull, functional acceptance. This was the cost of knowing the paths, of keeping people safe by choosing who wasn't. The tunnel opened into the cavern, and the frozen lake greeted us with a sound like distant thunder. Cracks laced its surface now, spreading slowly, deliberately, as if the ice were breathing. The shapes beneath had shifted. Some pressed up against the ice from below, faces distorted, mouths open in silent screams, or, worse, in rictus grins. The elk stopped at the water's edge. "Do you see it now?" it asked. I did. Not a single entity, not a monster waiting to be named. It was the place itself, the convergence of decisions layered over decades, military experiments abandoned but not dismantled, tribal warnings ignored and then quietly repurposed. A living system that learned to wear whatever shape was necessary to survive. Sometimes that shape had antlers. Sometimes it wore a badge. "You keep it fed," I said. The elk inclined its head. "We keep it balanced." The ice split with a sound that felt like my spine breaking. A section near the center collapsed inward, water surging up, black and viscous. Something rose with it, not emerging so much as unfolding, like a structure remembering its purpose. I couldn't describe it if I tried. No edges that made sense, no consistent scale. It reflected pieces of the cavern, the bunkers, the bones, rearranging them into impossible geometries that made my eyes water and my thoughts skid. Within it, faces appeared and vanished, those who had come before, preserved not as bodies but as impressions. I felt the pull then, not physical, conceptual, a sense that if I stepped forward, I wouldn't drown. I would disperse. "Why me?" I asked, though the answer was already there, heavy and unavoidable. "You stayed," the elk said. "You listened. You remembered." The lake surged again, water spilling over the edges, lapping at my boots. The cold was immediate, invasive, but beneath it was warmth, an impossible heat that seeped upward into my bones, into the fractures in my mind where guilt had hollowed me out. Images flooded me one last time, but not accusations. Logistics. Routes adjusted. Reports altered. A child led away from a trail just in time. A family diverted down a safer road without knowing why. Loss distributed so the system could persist. "Step in," the elk said softly. "Or don't. Either way, the forest will continue." I looked back toward the tunnel, toward the station above that now felt like a memory from another life. towards sunlight and paperwork and the illusion of control. I thought of the hoofprints on concrete, of the radio whispers, of the people who would come looking for answers and find only trees. I stepped forward. The water closed over my boots, my knees, my waist. Pain flared and then dulled, replaced by a spreading numbness that carried with it an odd clarity. The thing in the lake shifted, accommodating me, its surface rippling with recognition. The elk watched, unmoving. As the water reached my chest, I felt something detach, not my body, but the part of me that insisted on edges, on names, on endings. The pressure in my chest eased for the first time in months. I didn't sink. I diffused. I became aware of paths not as lines on a map, but as currents. Of people moving through the forest like sparks, bright and brief, of danger pooling in low places, waiting. I felt the station above me as a node, a listening post, a place where the system could speak if it needed to. The elk was there and not there, a mask worn when necessary. "You'll return," it said, though its voice was already distant. The cavern receded. The lake stilled. The cracks sealed. I woke up on the station floor at dawn, soaked to the skin, lungs burning, sidearm cold against my ribs. The basement door was sealed again. My injuries were gone, save for faint scars where the water had touched me. The radio crackled to life. A call came in about a missing camper near the restricted valley. A family reported hearing voices from the trees calling their names. I answered calmly. I rerouted the search, adjusted the paths. Outside, an elk stood at the tree line, ash-colored and tall, antlers catching the light. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes where there should have been none, deep and dark and full of something like relief. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. I don't know how long I have left. Time feels different now, stretched thin, worn smooth. I still file reports, still lock the doors at night, still hear the breathing beneath the floor when the forest needs reminding. If this recording is found, if you're listening to it somewhere warm and safe, understand this. Some places are not meant to be solved. Some disappearances are maintenance, and some guardians do not get to leave. If an elk with no eyes ever stands at the edge of your light and listens when you speak, do not follow it. And if you do, make sure you're ready to stay.